welcome to anybody who is watching this recording on YouTube. I'm going to pick up on the talk from Sunday. So if anybody doesn't recognize what we're talking about, then please do have a look at the recording from Sunday's talk, which was about abiding in Jesus's word. There's that wonderful passage, which I think I touched on Sunday, from Luke 6, verses 12 to 19, when it says that Jesus went up a mountainside to pray, spent the night praying to God, and when morning came, he called his disciples to him, and he chose 12 of them, and he designated them apostles. He spent a night praying, presumably about that decision. And then we're given the names of the 12. And then he goes on that Jesus went down with them and stood on a level place, and a large crowd of disciples were there. A great number of people from all over Judea, Jerusalem, and from the coastal region around Tyre and Sidon had come to hear him and be healed of their diseases. And those troubled by spirits were cured. And the people all tried to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. So let me pop something up on the screen, and we'll have a look at this. Here it comes. So we're looking at the first of 3 marks of a disciple. This one is abiding in Jesus' word. So we've read that passage from Luke chapter 6, and there's it's an example of Jesus doing the up thing, spent the night praying, deeply involved with Father there and spending time with him, and then having spent that night praying, comes down, chooses 12 from among the disciples, and we get a little bit of an insight of the in thing, the group developing. He goes with them, goes to this larger crowd, a great number, and starts moving out a bit in his ministry there. All those folks who come to hear and be healed, and we're told that this power is coming out from him. And it's a lovely example of this thing that we've been talking about this last couple of weeks, of our relationship up with Father, passionate spirituality, our relationship in with this community that we're part of, radical community, and then the outward thing with, I guess, what we call missionary enthusiasm, but just loving the least, the last, the lost, all those around us. And we translate that into discipleship for us. If we want to be like Jesus, then the best thing we can do is try and behave a little bit like him. And so we've got that up thing going on, passionate spirituality, radical community, and a bit of out missionary enthusiasm. So you know all of that. We've touched on that before, and that's no big surprise to you. Let me pull that down. There it goes. So for us apprentices, as followers of Jesus, learners of Jesus, it's a good model for us to learn from, handy language to use when we're discussing our own discipleship. And if we ask one another, how's the up thing going? How's your relationship with Father going at the moment, and so on? It's a nice vocabulary for us. I mentioned a quote that I love from Dallas Willard. His description of discipleship goes a bit like this: a disciple is a person who's decided that the most important thing in life is to learn to do what Jesus said to do. An emphasis on listening to what Jesus says. A disciple is not a person who necessarily has things under control or knows a lot of things. Disciple simply are people who are constantly revising their affairs to carry through on this decision to follow Jesus, learning to do what Jesus said to do. So there's some verses that we looked at on Sunday. Let me remind you of them. Here they come up on the screen. So John 6, we had a look at this one. And it says in there that From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Jesus had done some teaching earlier on in the chapter, and as a result of that, some decided just not to follow him. And he says to those that are around him, "You do not want to leave too, do you?" Jesus asked the 12, and Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. You have the words of eternal life." What Jesus speaks, what he says, what he teaches. And then in Matthew 7, we looked at this little parable at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus wraps up all this teaching with a bit of a challenge. "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." So pull that down. All of this is familiar to you so far. So in this reading from John chapter 6, Peter says to Jesus, "You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." And in Matthew's account, Jesus explains this principle of building lives based on his words with this parable of these two builders, which is a lovely picture, great way of doing it. This conclusion of all this teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus has taught about living life differently, living life according to some of Jesus' words and what he's explained, some challenges put in there, issues around anger and bitterness, marriage, adultery and divorce, revenge and loving enemies, how we give, how we use our money, all this hard stuff that he teaches about, prayer and fasting, worry, judging others, all the stuff that we do day by day. And the parable provokes a question within us. What will I do with Jesus' words? What will you do with Jesus' words? The implication is, you're going to be wise or you're going to be foolish? Are you going to listen and pay attention and live by these words or not? And so what will we do? What will we do? So all of that is kind of your introduction to refresh you. But here's something to think about and to start us off. If we're thinking there of Dallas Willard's words, one of his definitions about what a disciple is, and he keeps it fairly straightforward. He says a disciple is a person who has decided that the most important thing in their life is to learn how to live by what Jesus said to do. Disciple is not a person who has things under control necessarily or knows a lot of things. Good job, because I don't necessarily think I've got things under control. I don't think I know that much. Disciples simply are people who are constantly revising their affairs to carry through, to keep going on their decision to follow Jesus, to keep moving and traveling with him. So what I'd like you to do, just to do your first little chat together, is just have a chat about this. How do you learn from Jesus's words? How do you go about discovering Jesus's words? How do you do that? How do you learn from Jesus' words? And have a chat amongst yourselves and share between you how you do it, and listen to one another's ways and means of doing it. And then second part of that is, how do you revise your following of Jesus? Are you doing your following of Jesus now exactly the same as you did however many years ago you became a Christian, or have you tweaked it and changed it, and are you doing it differently now, and why? How do you revise your following of Jesus? Do you check in with him and ask him? I just have that discussion amongst yourselves about the nature of your listening to Jesus' words, learning from them and following them, applying them to your life. And be honest. If it's hard, and if you don't do it because it's hard, then say so, because that's kind of what we're trying to work through together.